couple of days where God said to Abraham, look to the north, look to the south, look to the east, look at all this land I give to you. But then by reason of their wickedness, they were carried off to Egypt, and they come back 400 years later, and now they get to the border of the promised land, and Moses dies, and Joshua is raised up, and we have what the Bible calls the Conquest, Joshua 1-7. Now, understand this, that, and let me start again by reminding you that the argument is, wait, we don't find a widespread pattern of destruction. All right, let's think biblically. The fact is that God made stunning promises to Israel. A lot more melancholy promises. Yeah. But he made stunning promises to Israel. And he promised them, think about this, to give them walled cities to live in they never built. Houses to live in that they never built. Vineyards to harvest that they never planted. Well, now, how is God going to fulfill that promise? You know the key? This is what people understand. The key to God fulfilling that promise was his belief at Kadesh Barnea. Now think about it. Mount Sinai, they accept the covenant, they make their way to Kadesh Barnea. When they get to Kadesh Barnea, they are in the land. As a matter of fact, they send the 12 spies out to lay out a strategy. But 10 of the 12 spies come back, and you know they're giants in the land, and basically ixnay on the unquest K. That's the but they say we're not doing it. We're not going in. And you know what they say? They say, would to God our carcasses would lie in this wilderness. And Yahweh said, you know what? That could be right. So what happens is, for 38 years they wander, and all they're doing is burying their dead. About 80 funerals a day, if you take the biblical numbers. For 38 years. Now, what is going on in this land during those 38 years? And there are all these Canaanite nations, and they war among themselves, and they have their own problems and so on. But they know what's on the horizon. They know very well that the chariots of Egypt are lying about them. See, they know that Sihon lies. And these people, and so you know what they're doing? They're making coalitions. They're deciding, no, rather than fighting among ourselves, we're going to arm ourselves against this people and their God. And they know he's a powerful God, but they're polytheists. And okay, Yahweh's a big deal, but our gods are pretty powerful too. And so if we arrange things just right, and one of the most important dynamics of the coalitions is, rather than arming every walled city, and then taking Israel on every walled city, we'll choose one central city, we'll arm that city, or we'll prepare that city for battle, and then all the armies will come together and fight the Israelites, and we'll bring all of our gods to that central place. So now we got all of our gods and all of our armies ganged up against Israel and his God in the place of our choosing. We get to be the home team. And so, and that's exactly what we do. Now, does that make sense to you? So by reason of that coalition, let's think about the conquest. And we're going to talk about Jericho tomorrow more carefully. But they cross over, time out. You know, you got to think about it. And you can see it on that map, but you know that, all right, Kadesh Barnea is way down south. It's off your map. It's way down in the Negev. That's where they enter. They're coming up from Egypt. They get to Kadesh Barnea. They're in the land. They send in the spies. We're not doing it for 38 years. Have you ever thought about this? Why then, toward the end of his life, does Moses bring them all the way down through Edom and all the way up to Moab, just north of the Dead Sea? Why? They're going to attack down here. Why? Because this country has armed itself, and Joshua knows, Moses knows, that north-south traffic is very, very difficult, and so if he can attack, first of all, in the center part of the country, he's going to break up the north from the south. That makes sense to you? Now, that's not in the Bible, but what is in the Bible is there's got to be some reason, and everything we know about the country would all right, so here's my point.
for all of these years, 38 years, these places are arming themselves. No, they're forming these coalitions. And therefore, when Joshua, let's walk through the context. Number one is Jericho. Now, Jericho is kind of the odd man out because it's really not one of those coalitions. It just was a hugely fortified city that guarded the entrance right there. So, Jericho is destroyed and burned. We're going to talk about showing the burning tomorrow. Secondly, they go up, and the central fortification where all the kings have come together is a place. It's really not so much a city as it's just a place that they had fortified to the teeth because they were going to, and the Israelites were approaching, called Ai, or Ai. I'm going to take you there, and we'll stand on Tel Hazor. It's amazing. But they conquered it and burned it. Now, the third coalition was in the south. And all the kings of the south had come together and decided to fortify a city called Gibeon. Now, what did the Gibeonites do? This is really an important part of the story. The Gibeonites came to their senses. Now, we're going to stand on a roof and we'll look down and tell this story about the Gibeonites coming up and lying to Joshua or going down. And so, remember that whole story? But they came over. They sided with the Israelites. They converted. They became Yahweh's, for heaven's sake. And that's what's at stake here. And for that reason, the other kings said, wait a minute, that's our city. And they attack Gibeon, and the Gibeonites, newly allied with Joshua, send a message out and say, get up here. And so Joshua marches all night, and hailstones fall on the sky, and the sun stands still. Why? Because all right, that's the third stage. The fourth stage is this. This is the northern stage. Now, I give this to you on this chart on page 34. It's just an attempt to summarize the strategy of the conquest. He's not going city to city, village to village, conquering people. He doesn't have to because of these coalitions. That's the key. That's why I say the key to the strategy is the 38 years of wandering during which these people are arming themselves to the teeth, forming these whole huge coalitions. Now, two things. I want to read you the story out of Joshua but understand this, and I should have said this earlier. All right, I'd love to talk about this. I'm frankly, maybe it's because I'm just morally insensitive, I don't know, but I'm not as troubled as many are about God's command that the Canaanites be entirely slaughtered. I think it makes perfectly moral and biblical sense. But anyway, we all kind of stumble over that. Well, man, woman, and child have to be slaughtered. All right, we can talk about that another time, period. That is not Joshua's mandate. Joshua is not told to slaughter everybody. As a matter of fact, God says, I don't want you to slaughter everybody because I made some promises. So his mandate is to totally destroy the Canaanites' capacity to defend themselves. Now, what does that mean? Either destroy or capture the walled cities, because God said, I'm going to give you cities to live in. Or number two, wipe out the armies. Well, think about how handy it is. You know, and it's interesting because one of those scholars that I was referring to earlier, who's a very, very important biblical, inerrant scholar, an important seminary, argues that that Joshua is not entirely dependable because you got two different traditions. Because in Joshua chapter 12 it says Joshua did everything God commanded of him, and then in Joshua 13 it says these are the cities which were not yet conquered. Well, you must have two traditions. One tradition, no. He did everything he was commanded to do because he was commanded to wipe out the armies and capture the walled cities. That makes sense to you? And it's clear. And by the way, the reason, God gives us three reasons why he was going to do it this way. Rather than have Joshua just wipe out everybody, the armies of conquest. See, when they came to Israel, they camped at a place that we'll drive by and point it out tomorrow, called Gilgal. Remember that? Down by just north of the Dead Sea. And then they would stay there, and the armies of the conquest would go out to these various battles. Well, if they went out and conquered everybody, well, here's the thing. God said, I'm going to give you the walled cities to live in. I'm going to give you homes to live in. And if they had to destroy everything, see the problem? But then he said, I'm going to give you vineyards to harvest. Well, if the armies of conquest came up and wiped everybody out, there'd be nobody to tend the vineyards till the Jews showed up. So the fact is that the Bible could not be more explicit that God did not command Joshua to wipe everybody out. That command was given to the people. Joshua commissioned them. You go and you know, it's only old people, women, children in the cities, but they're going to defend. And by the way, there's another reason that God gives, as he gives three reasons why he's going to do it this. Number one is, I want to test you. I want to see if you'll obey me. So I'm going to set it up for you. Joshua's going to wipe out. He's going to capture and destroy the walled cities. He's going to wipe out the armies. But are you going to believe me? Are you going to obey me and complete the process? And he says, if you don't wipe them out, what? You're going to marry their daughters and worship their gods. That's the book of Judges. Here's Joshua, totally, completely obedient, gets everything done. The people refuse to finish the job. The book of Judges. All right. Secondly, he says, number one, I want to test your obedience. Number two, I want you to learn warfare. So, and I love that, because even though God is going to fight your battles and so on, but no, you're not going to sit in the easy chair and wait. You need to know how to defend yourself. That the Bible never staggers at that, what is regarded by some to be attention. You know, wait, if God's going to do it, why do I have to work? Oh, no. I told somebody yesterday, the whole moral universe can be reduced to this. If anything good happens, God gets all the glory. And if anything bad happens, we get all the glory. That's hard anyway. Find another moral universe to live in. God made this, I mean, that's how he runs it. Well, my point is that it's so interesting. He said, I want you to learn warfare. And the third one is, I don't want those vineyards to rot before the people arrive. Does that make sense to you? All right, now let's finish the story. Joshua chapter 11. So, what I just described to you in terms of the strategy and so on is so well represented here in this final stage of the conquest, which is the northern conquest. So Joshua chapter 11. Now watch. It's gonna be a little what's the word I'm after? A little boring, but I mean it's a long list. But listen. And it came to pass when Yabin, king of Hazor, heard these things. Now this is the conquest. This is one of the Canaanite peoples who are here. And there's a king by the name of Yabin. And when he heard these things, heard what? Heard what happened at Gibeon. So now Ai has fallen, Jericho has fallen, Gibeon is going over. He knew he was next. That's the point. And so watch this. He sent to, here it is, a little tedious. He sent to Jobab, king of Adon, to the king of Shimron, to the king of Akshap, to the kings who were from the north in the mountains of the plains south of Kinnereth, in the lowland, in the heights of Dor on the west, all the way over the Mediterranean, to the Canaanites in the east, to the west, the Amorite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Jebusite, in the mountains. See what this king here. As a matter of fact, let me just take you down real quick to verse 25, and then verse 30 rather. I'll come back to it. But he simply says there, Hazor was formerly the head of all these kingdoms. So you got all these kings and kinglets and all these hills, and they got their walled cities and so on. But when Jabin, who is head of the whole crowd, hears, he calls them all. And so they went out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore in multitude, with very many horses, chariots. When all those kings had met together, they came and camped together at the waters of Merom. Now listen, we don't know where the waters of Merom are. But the point is that over those 38 years, the home team got to choose the field. And there's some, and because this Hazor guarded this broad Hula Valley, they were into chariots. They had a lot of chariots. So they wanted their warfare to be not on a hill, but so they went down. We don't know where it is, but you can bet they had spent decades getting this ready, preparing for battle. Now we're not told what. All it says, if you go down to verse 8, all it says is, the Lord delivered them, that is, all these kings and their soldiers, into the hand of Israel, who defeated them and chased them to the greater side of the brook Merciful, and so on. So the point is that they were totally victorious, the Israelites, as we would expect. Then look at verse 10. Then Joshua turned back at that time and took Hazor and struck its king, because the battle really wasn't here. It was out there around the Rome somewhere, the place they had chosen. But now he comes back, and the king was hiding up here, and he takes the king, and notice verse 12. Verse 11. And they struck all the people who were in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was none left breathing. Then he burned Hazor with fire. Now, let me go a little further. So look at the next verse 12. It says, all the cities of those kings and all their kings that Joshua took and struck with the edge of the sword. In other words, the word took there. Joshua took and struck all the cities. It doesn't mean destroyed. It means captured. All that was left was, so he went and took the walled cities and struck them with the edge of the sword, killed everybody. He utterly destroyed them, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded. But watch this. Look at verse 13. As for the cities that stood on their mountains, Israel burned none of them, except Hazor only. Now, are you ahead of me? All right, let's go back. The big argument is, it couldn't have been 14 cities where the Bible puts it, because we don't find a widespread repentance. In verse 3 cities, Jericho, Ai, Hazor. Guess what? There is a burn layer exactly where we need it in all 3 of those cities. Now, do you hear what I'm saying to you? We would be horrified to discover a widespread pattern of destruction, as it says, he left the cities standing on their mountains. That makes sense to you? The argument is absolutely vacuous, but it's universally accepted. So, I'll put a period on it, and I got one more thing to tell you. This is one of the 3 cities which, according to the Bible, Joshua burned. Now remember that the critical argument, the argument, whatever, is that it only happened in the 13th century, the 1200s. Got a bit of a problem here. Because, now here, that's why I like to have you in here. I want you to look around behind you, and this is a very visible, unmistakable burn. And by the way, they've done the same thing here with the restoration lines, what they've restored and so on. But what I want you to see all around behind you are these basalt blocks that are reduced to cinder. That's a burning. Everybody acknowledges that. Now there are places along the wall here behind the cinder where you can see some of the ash and so on. That also is part of the burn there. But everybody says, you got a major, and this is not a kitchen fire, this is a national over your shoulder, for I'm saying. This is engineered. You gotta bring wood in and pile it here. You're trying to make it uninhabitable. So here we are in Hazor. There's an absolutely unmistakable burn layer. Here's the problem, and I give you 2 pages on this in your booklet. It is important. The problem is that this is certainly a 13th century burn. The pottery, everything about it, nobody really disputes this. This burn layer is 1200s. So guess what? This becomes one of the most important arguments and on behalf of the late date of the It's called the late date versus the early date, the biblical date versus the late date. And one of the big arguments that Bible believers use, the burn layer at Hazor is 13th century. And I'll tell you something else. This is big. I should have left this out. This was clearly a temple on the Acropolis. And guess what they found on the floor of this temple? Idols smashed to pieces. Wow. Now, to the archaeologists, that is dead certain signatory proof that this is an Israeli destruction, because no other people destroyed idols. You took them home. You're added to your shelf. You made it part of your trophy cabinet. Only Israel. So everybody says this is a Israeli destruction and it's 13th century. We're in trouble now, aren't we? No. This is Deborah. Deborah conquers now. Now we gotta get back into the book of Judges, but fast forward to the period of Judges and well into the Judges. This king, he's a later king, the guy who, he's dead, the guy who Joshua conquered, but then the city is rebuilt and they keep calling their kings. Jabin is quite clearly a dynastic title. So another king from Hazor, remember he goes all the way down to the Jezreel Valley and sets up shop and begins in trouble. And this is Mount Tabor, and Deborah defeats them. And it's interesting that in the record of Deborah's conquest, it says, I'm going to read it to you. This is Judges chapter 4, and we're told, hold on here, we're told, well, I'll just read it to you. It's talking about Deborah and Barak just defeating and Yael with a tin peg through the guy's sister's head and so on. But so it says, on that day God subdued Jabin, king of Canaan, in the presence of the children of Israel. Now watch this. And the hand of the children of Israel grew stronger and stronger against Jabin, king of Canaan, until they had destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. Now that's all we're told. But it fits perfectly with the scripture that this is Deborah. Does that make sense to you? Now that's what. And I've never been able to see it. Maybe Ben could help me find it if we're nearby. But there is another burn layer. And this is what I give you in that article I gave you in the booklet. And there is a burn layer. A friend of mine, Doug Petrovich, dug here for a couple of years. He saw that burn layer. He argues strongly. He's one of the authors that I cite there. And it was interesting that he was part of the team here. He's a very, very competent, schooled, well-educated, Bible-believing archaeologist, Doug Petrovich. And he was digging here, and the primary archaeologist, I think, was Ben Tor, if I remember right. But at any rate, and he had us on perfectly good terms and so on. But then Doug published that was the Conquest, the lower layer. Does that make sense to you? And this is Deborah. And he was notified he wasn't welcome on this site anymore. So, so I'm going to nail it down one more time. The argument is, and again, this is more, it takes upon itself an importance greater than that which is absolutely indigenous. You know what I'm saying? It's more important than it might be because it is so out of fashion to accept the biblical testimony. And you're surrendering your creds in the academic world if you argue for the biblical date. And yet, I'm saying hard data, simple arithmetic, 1446, that's the Exodus. 40 years later, the Conquest, that's 1400. And the big argument is we don't find a widespread pattern of destruction. We don't want, oh, by the way, that I mentioned to you, what's going on in the 13th century, BC, in this land? It's the period of the Judges. We want widespread destruction. You got all these kings coming in, these marauding kings, and tearing down all these, walled cities so that they could have this protection racket and so on. Bingo, we're happy to have all sorts of destruction in the 13th century, but we don't want it in the 15th century, at the end of the 15th century. As the Bible says explicitly, he burned these cities, the other cities he left standing on their mountains, so that he could fulfill the promise. Walled cities is built. All right, any questions about that?
So this burning up here is Deborah?
This is Deborah. Yeah, exactly.
Joshua's burning in the lower city?
Pardon me?
Joshua's burning in the lower city?
No. It's beneath us.
Oh, it's beneath.
Yeah, it was a destruction. Then it was rebuilt.
It's beneath this burning.
That's right. On this same
When the guy dug
area.
it up, they didn't want to continue.
Pardon me?
When the guy dug it up and thought he found Joshua,